Hello and welcome. Tonight we are discussing what can the fertility sector learn from the infected blood scandal and inquiry. The hashtag is infected blood, and this event is taking place thanks to the generous support of the Scottish Government. I'm Sarah Norcross, Director of PET, and I'm chairing the discussion. The UK's infected blood scandal is widely regarded as one of the country's worst ever treatment disasters. Between the 1970s and 1990s, tens of thousands of people in the UK were infected, predominantly with HIV and hepatitis C, as a result of being given blood or blood products or other tissue that was contaminated. And most of the infections were contracted either from blood transfusions, so for example, during childbirth, surgery, or treatment for an injury, or from treatments for bleeding disorders such as haemophilia. There have been many thousands of deaths attributed to these infections, and many people, relatives of people infected, could seek compensation under new laws that were laid before Parliament this month. Now, I remember many years ago, probably more than a decade ago, going to a gene and cell therapy conference. It was a STEM day, really, and hearing a patient advocate talk about haemophilia. He talked about the condition, his treatment for it. But what I remember most from his presentation was talking about the friends that he had lost as a result of the contaminated blood scandal and the contaminated blood they've been given as part of their treatment. Now, what on earth has this got to do with fertility treatment, you're wondering? And I have to admit, I was scratching my head at first, thinking, how does this all tie together? And to give an example, albeit one which doesn't involve blood or human tissue, um, but to sort of get you sort of thinking about this sort of as a broader issue, really. So, as many of you will know, embryos are often frozen in order to be stored. So, what if there's a faulty batch of the special freezing fluid that is used if eggs or embryos are stored for future use? What protocols do you have in place to handle this? Well, last year, in response to such an incident involving freezing fluid, I ended up on the national news talking to the presenters on Radio 4's Today programme, having to explain what had happened. And this was because there was seemingly no one else available to talk about it to the public. So it was Muggins here, who was sort of getting the call at 6 o'clock in the morning saying, "We're desperate for someone to come on and talk. Can you do it?" And so I suppose it's a question of starting to think about, are you prepared to communicate with patients in a timely way if something goes wrong on scale, not just on one individual's treatment? Are they going to hear about it first on the news? Are you prepared to speak to the media? Would you be allowed to speak to the media if your clinic is affected by something like this? And are you prepared? Do you have systems in place to handle a large volume of calls from concerned patients who would be very, quite rightly worried if they heard something about these, even if it's not in your clinic? They may wonder if it affects them. Another scenario where lessons could be learned in the fertility sector is in the use of donated gametes. And I won't be saying anything about that because I think we'll be hearing a lot more on that topic from our first speaker. So at this PET event, we have experts in assisted conception, in blood and tissue donation, plus members of the medical ethics expert group that was appointed to advise the infected blood inquiry. So we're going to explore what the fertility sector may learn from the infected blood scandal. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce this evening's first speaker, who is Professor Abha Maheshwari. Abha is the lead clinician at Fertility Scotland. She's also the clinical director and lead consultant for reproductive medicine and surgery at the Aberdeen Fertility Centre. She's editor-in-chief of the open access journal Human Reproduction, and she's a contributor to many books, including Reproductive Medicine for the MRCOG, and controversies in assisted reproduction.
Just to correct Sarah, I am Editor-in-Chief for Human Fertility, which is official journal for British Fertility Society, not Human Reproduction. But thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this important topic of infected blood inquiry and what has it got to do with fertility. So the common question I get asked is fertility and blood. What is the relation? As fertility specialists, we actually stay away from blood and we don't trouble our blood transfusion clinics because we don't do hemorrhages as part of our treatments. But there are some similarities. We are dealing both with substances of human origin. And we are both covered by very heavy legislation, much more than any other clinical area in the hospitals that I'm aware of. That's why I got inspected right, left, and center. Every month almost we are being inspected by one or the other authorities. We have extensive quality management systems that fertility sector require as part of HFEA and ISO, as well as obviously blood transfusion services require for their regulations. And we need to look at the impact on donor as well as recipients, whether it's blood, whether it's fertility, the gametes. But bloods and gametes are not the same, they are different. One is saving life and other one is creating new life. There is anonymity when you do the blood donation, but when you do the gametes donation at the age of 16 in UK, the children born can know a lot. At the age of 18, they can know much more. But when DNA testing is in place, the age of 16 and 18 doesn't count because with DNA testing, a lot of things are known by everybody and anybody. You just need to do DNA testing. There are limited places where you can donate gametes, whereas for blood transfusion services, there are much more wider network and you can donate blood nearer to your home. But for gametes, it has to be the licensed fertility services. And there are different processes involved, obviously, in blood donation, whether you're doing the egg or sperm freezing. And egg and sperm donation, obviously, themselves have got different processes. What is also interesting is we work quite a lot with Scottish National Blood Transfusion Services, and they follow JPAC, which is Joint United Kingdom Blood Transfusion and Tissue Plantation Services. And as you can see, this is followed by whole of UK. There are donor selection guidelines for tissue and cells. They're for whole blood and component. And they're not just overarching guidelines. They are very, very detailed. They go through each and every condition that you can think of. They're quite lengthy guidance documents, and they're constantly being updated as the infection comes through, a new infection, and information is sent to all the people who are in the network to say what can we do with this infection, whether we defer the donor, how long we defer the donor, or we accept that donor. So they are very, very extensive guidelines. For gametes, there are Code of Practice from HFEA. There is whole section 11 in the Code of Practice, which covers donor recruitment, assessment, and screening. But there's quite a lot of overarching. This is nowhere as detailed as the JPAC. There are further guidance from British Fertility Society, which was last published in 2021. They are under review right now, and hopefully a next one will be published soon. But they are, again, overarching. They don't go through each and every condition like the JPAC goes. What we have done in Scotland is we have collaborated with National Blood Transfusion Services, all 4 tertiary centres in the Scotland together. And what we have produced is a questionnaire that a donor answers. It's a very, very detailed questionnaire. Just to give you a snapshot, and we used quite a lot of questionnaires from across the world to create it. And this was created in collaboration with Scottish National Blood Transfusion Services. And it's a 15-page questionnaire. So I'll just give you a snippet of the 2 pages, how it is, so that we get a very, very detailed history, and all centers in the Scotland gets a similar history from the donors. And if any of them are positive, then we have created a guidance, which is not exactly the JPEG for gametes, but it is a guidance, and it is very, very detailed. Again, this is a collaborative work across the Scotland for all centers, as you can see from the logo, and patient organization, along with blood transfusion services. This is just the example of what this guidance contained. It has lots of condition given alphabetically, whether it's donors, based on donors history, family history. There are extra comments so that we can have much more detailed guidance. And this is all we have learned a lot by working with the blood transfusion services, because similar guidance does not exist for the gametes before this was created. However, lately, there are new European regulations as well, because substances of human origin, SOHO, has been clubbed together, which is all the gametes as well, along with the blood transfusion things. So what I think is learning from the infected blood inquiry is very, very important, because of all the work that I've just shown you, and then we work together. There is also the fact that infected blood inquiry also tells us that the reason all that infections happened is because we are short of gametes. We were short of blood. We imported it from elsewhere, but we are doing exactly the same in fertility. We are short of donor gametes. We are importing donor gametes, and donor could be donating elsewhere as well. They're not just limited to UK. Regulations are there in UK, but they're different in different countries. And yes, even when we import from external banks, they are giving us paperwork that they're abiding by the regulations. We still have fragmented system. There are regional choices, because when there is an overarching guidance, then you can interpret them differently, and different clinicians can interpret them differently. So there is not similar coordinated approach as we have for blood. And careful and rigorous donor selection is not that. It is very rigorous, because we have got HFEA guidance, but unfortunately, it's not that rigorous, because not having that detailed guidance from like we have for JPAC. So I think what we need to learn from infected blood inquiry, and it is really, really important that we don't ignore it, because bloods and gametes have got lots and lots in common. And as I just showed you, there is a paper written by Marc Turner and Sharon Zara, which is published in Human Fertility, and I would strongly encourage everybody to read it, because it gives you all the details that you need to know, that why it is important to consider infected blood inquiry and the findings from it, and apply that to the gamete donation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abha. And I'd just like to say that it was Abha who originally suggested that PET explore the implications of the infected blood scandal for the fertility sector. So thank you, Abha, not just for a great presentation, but also for being the inspiration for tonight's event. Our next speaker is Professor Marc Turner. Marc is Director of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, a member of the UK Government's Advisory Committee on the Safety of Blood, Tissues and Organs. He's a commissioner at the Commission of Human Medicines, a member of the Scottish Medicines Consortium. He's Professor of Cellular Therapy at the University of Edinburgh's Institute for Regeneration and Repair, and he's co-editor of the book Essentials of Tissue and Cells Banking.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Abha has given a very good background to the nature of the relationship, or the commonalities and concerns from blood components and blood across all substances of human origin. There are many common themes across tissues, cells, organs, and gametes and reproductive tissues. To think a little bit about the infected blood inquiry itself, I think it's important to reflect that during the 1970s and 80s, it's thought that around 30,000 people were either infected or seriously affected by HIV or hepatitis C. This was obviously in the early days of discovery and understanding of these infections. Through blood transfusion, of whom around 3,000 have died. Two main groups of patients affected. Those who received various kinds of blood components, so red blood cells, platelets, or clinical plasma. In the UK, around 2 to 2.5 million blood components are given each year, so a very sizable amount. And actually, blood transfusion was more common 30 or 40 years ago than it is now as a result of refinements in clinical practice and really quite rigorous efforts to try not to transfuse blood components when not required. The other large component of people infected and affected related to what we call plasma-derived medicinal products. So plasma can be pooled and fractionated during a process called cone fractionation into various components, which then make up plasma-derived medicinal products. So things like coagulation factors, that is factor 8, factor 9, things like prothrombin complex concentrates, which can be used for correcting warfarin overdosage and so on. Immunoglobulins, all the IV and subcut immunoglobulin, which is used for patients with primary immune deficiencies or for treating various kinds of autoimmune conditions, ITP, Guillain-Barré, and so on, is plasma derived, as are a fair proportion of specific immunoglobulins like anti-D, for example. And then most of the albumin that you use, either 4.5% or 20% albumin, is also plasma derived. And as I said, these are derived from pooling large amounts of plasma, up to 10 or 20,000 donations to manufacture these products, which then go into large numbers of different patients. So that you can see that the risk was disproportionate amongst plasma products, because once a plasma product batch had become contaminated from even a single infected donor, then the risk was posed to most of the recipients who were receiving that, and that's why very large numbers of patients, particularly with haemophilia A or haemophilia, became infected. It's important to understand that although the infected blood inquiry focused on HIV and hepatitis C, of course, there's also people who became infected with hepatitis B, and lesser numbers of people with other kinds of transfusion transmissible infections like cytomegalovirus, as a for example. So the infected blood inquiry was limited to a certain extent in its scope, but certainly of a very long duration. I think I also wanted to convey to the IBI in some ways is accumulation of a process that has been going on for a number of decades now. So you need to be mindful that there have been inquiries in a number of other countries, including the Crever inquiry in Canada, which led to the replacement of the Red Cross blood service with an alternative arrangement, quite in Portugal, Japan, France, Ireland, and Italy, really from, as you can see, the kind of early to mid 1990s onwards. In some of those inquiries, senior doctors or senior executives spent time in jail for as a result of those inquiries or proceedings flowing down from them. In the UK also, there have been really 4 major inquiries or judicial reviews. The first of which was the so-called Burton inquiry, Lord Justice Burton, against the National Blood Authority, which found that blood components were subject to the Consumer Protection Act. The Archer inquiry, 2007 to 2009, which was not publicly funded, but which we participated in and supported. There have been House of Commons Science and Technology Committee investigations. In Scotland, we had the Penrose inquiry between 2008 and 2015, and then the infected blood inquiry on a UK basis came shortly after that, starting around 2015 and going through to 2024. But there's also been certainly fatal accident inquiry in Scotland, a variety of different civil legal cases, and governmental inquiries, both Scottish government and UK government. And you need to bear in mind that we are all subject to the constraints of both the Consumer Protection Act and the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act. So as well as the ethical considerations, there's a very large legal framework around the safety of blood, plasma products, and by inference, I would say, other substances of human origin. That's tissues, cells, and gametes. The IBI itself, as I said, was formally announced in 2017, started taking evidence in April 2019. At that time, I would say it was the largest public inquiry that has been conducted. I think probably the UK COVID inquiry has superseded in that regard. Certainly in terms of the number of people harmed, but also its geographical and particularly its temporal scope. This inquiry, as I think the chair said at the start of the meeting, they went right back into the early to mid 1970s, which was always obviously a great challenge for everybody, for the inquiry itself, for patients and their relatives, and for people who were called to testify. Over 2,000 core participants, over 100,000 pieces of documentary evidence, over 5,000 written statements, and 300 to 400 personal testimony were examined. So extremely comprehensive. And his final report was published on the 20th of May, over 2,000 pages and seven volumes. There were 12 recommendations, but that's really an understatement because each of those recommendations consisted of a number of sub-clauses, so a series of really quite complex recommendations for government, for advisory committees, for blood services, and for the wider NHS. And as the chair referred to, the Infected Blood Compensation Authority has been established and has now commenced its work. I've limited myself to commenting on some of the key issues because we have limitations in time and we could get quite bogged down, but really in the detail, but really just to give you a kind of feel for the kind of issues that were of seminal importance. Self-sufficiency was clearly a very key issue. In reality, the UK has been largely self-sufficient in blood components, but that has certainly not been the case historically or today in regard to plasma-derived medicinal products, the vast majority of which are manufactured commercially, and there's a very high dependence across the world on US paid US donors. Contributing the plasma which goes in to make up these products. So even back in the 1970s and 80s, when the demand for plasma products was much less than it is today, only a proportion of those could be supplied by plasma from non-remunerated UK donors, and there was a significant amount of US plasma-derived medicinal products, factor 8 and factor 9 included, administered to patients. There was criticism in the inquiry, rightly in my view, of deficiencies at the time in timely implementation or in donor selection criteria and the kind of questions that donors were asked and the detail in which they were asked and how systemically and regularly they were asked, and particularly issues around at that time intravenous drug use, and there were a lot of concerns about blood sufficiency in the 1970s and 1980s, and it was actually quite common practice across the UK at one time to collect blood, for example, in prisons and other institutions. In fact, there was a thought that it was a social good for people who were in prison to be able to donate blood and contribute back to society. However, that ignored warning signals or perhaps didn't give due consideration to warning signals. For example, hepatitis B had a much higher prevalence amongst people in prison than among the general population. So that whole area of donor selection was a matter of significant concern. Similarly, donor screening. Now, of course, donor screening assays evolved over the period of time that we're discussing. Hepatitis B surface antigen testing first came in the early 1970s. HIV testing around about 1984 to 1985. Hepatitis C itself wasn't identified until 1989, and testing was introduced in September 1991. However, there were potential surrogate assays, for example, for ALT, which could be used as a potential surrogate assay for what was then called non-A, non-B hepatitis prior to the development of HCV testing, which were not implemented for various reasons at the time, and that was severely criticised both by the Penrose inquiry and by the IBI. There was the issue of look back, i.e., what steps did one take when one found retrospectively that a donor tested positive or that a patient had tested positive, to look back at their donors and other potentially exposed people. Issues related to plasma fractionation at pool size and the implementation of various techniques for virus inactivation, which were developed over the 1980s. The integrity and the implementation of quality management systems, and then clinical practice, and things such as the extent of informed consent for patients. I've summarised really, or to be more correctly, Sir Brian summarised the key lessons learned from his perspective, and I thought these were really worth reiterating. And he says, in several different places, both verbally at the closeout of the inquiry, but also in the report itself, that first and foremost, patient safety needs to be our paramount concern and guiding principle. Where there is uncertainty, which there is at times, some actions that can be taken should be taken on a precautionary basis rather than waiting for scientific certainty to be achieved. Risk needs to be considered from a broader public health perspective, rather than just necessarily on an individual patient perspective. There needs to be clarity in decision making, and that's often quite difficult if there's no clear locus for a single decision being made. I think that comes back to Abha's point around the way that we as UK Blood Services now manage that decision making in a unified way, and finally, the cost will clearly relevant factor should not be the relevant starting point. Patient safety should be, and that's really to remind you, colleagues, that we're obviously focused on the inquiry on two specific viruses. However, there are many other infectious agents that are known to be, or at least potentially to be, transmissible by blood and other substances of human origin, and which therefore need to be monitored and considered. There are also clearly, we all know, new and emergent infections, and breakout infections like SARS-CoV-2 are increasing in incidence. The number of pandemics is increasing in the current century, not decreasing, due to pressures of urbanization on rural areas, impact of climate change with change in the distribution of various vectors like mosquitoes, for example, the impact of globalization. We can see how rapidly SARS-CoV-2 spread out of Wuhan, and of course natural genetic variation occurring in known infectious agents, which we're understanding much better now with advances in genomics. The problem can often be that because viruses emerge and evolve and change, there can remain a degree of uncertainty over potential transmissibility by substances of human origin or pathogenicity, and that situation can evolve very rapidly. So a precautionary stance is very important in that kind of context.
Next, we have Professor Emma Cave. Emma is Professor of Healthcare Law at Durham University, and she's a Fellow of the Wolfson Research Institute for Health and Wellbeing. She was a member of the Medical Ethics Expert Group at the Infected Blood Inquiry and is author of the book The Mother of All Crimes and co-author of the book Medicine, Patients and the Law.
As Marc has set out, the final inquiry report in 2024 drew on a substantial body of evidence that included documentary evidence, oral testimonies from the infected and the affected, and also from clinicians and officials. And in addition to that, there were 9 expert reports on different issues from public health to statistics. I've been asked to talk to you about one of those expert reports, namely the Medical Ethics Group report that Bobbie and I convened for the inquiry. Each of the 9 expert groups received a series of questions which the inquiry team drew up in collaboration with core participants in the inquiry. Our group was asked to come up with written answers to a series of questions on relevant medical ethics principles. And our report was then published on the inquiry website. We were asked to defend and explain our views in an oral evidence session. And then, a couple of years later in 2024, Sir Brian drew on this and the other expert reports and the rest of the enormous body of evidence in making his final recommendations. Now, at first sight, the inquiry on bloodborne infections and the fertility sector seem to have little in common, and I think both Abha and Marc have spoken convincingly to put that right and to set out the connections. I don't intend to repeat that here, except to reiterate Sir Brian's recommendation in his final report that learning must be shared widely. And as such, there are aspects of the report that are relevant across all sectors, and also some particularly important connections with the fertility sector, in that both of these contexts involve sensitive and highly regulated medical procedures. Both infertility and the contaminated blood scandal involved social stigma that can cause psychological burdens and can impact on quality of life. And also, they're both involving fast-paced scientific developments with which the law and sometimes professional guidance can struggle to keep up. So I want to focus on 3 key lessons from our expert report, namely the importance of informed consent, the importance of record keeping, and finally, and more generally, the value of having robust and agile regulation. So the first lesson is on informed consent. Many patients who received contaminated blood did so without full disclosure from healthcare providers about the possible dangers. Some were enrolled in research without their knowledge and consent, and this led to some significant breaches of trust. The fertility sector, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, isn't immune from consent-related scandal. Some of the scandals are historical. A prominent one is the case of a retired removals man from Essex who received a call from a woman called Catherine Simpson to tell him she was his biological daughter. He recalled attending Dr. Boyd's fertility clinic in London in the late 1960s in order to have some checks on his fertility. he had absolutely no knowledge of his sperm then being used in another couple's IVF treatment. Catherine made the connection only after taking an Ancestry.com DNA test, which is a technology that was inconceivable at the time that the treatment took place. The law and professional codes and guidance have come a long way since the 1960s, but our processes still sometimes fall short, as in the ARB case a few years back, when a patient forged a consent form to misrepresent her ex-partner's consent to fertility treatment using their frozen embryos. So there are lessons for regulators in terms of revising guidance to ensure that it's fit for purpose. There are lessons for clinicians about upholding consent principles. And there are lessons for both with regard to extending beyond the legal focus of consent on disclosure of risk to make sure that consent processes are meaningful. The inquiry was clear that communication should have been better. Not just communication of risks and alternatives, but also of consequences, of available tests, of results, of implications. A very shocking example involved children with bleeding disorders at Trelaw School, which is a specialist school providing therapy alongside education. These children were exposed to infected blood and then tested for infections and told in batches of 5, you haven't been infected. So a key lesson for the fertility sector is in communicating accurately and honestly about risks, about uncertainty of risks, about the possibility of human error, and about the likelihood of success. There have been a number of allegations in recent times about overpromising regarding treatment add-ons and success rates. As the inquiry makes very clear, there can be no proper consent without adequate communication. The second lesson concerns the importance of record keeping and tracking systems. This was one of the major failures during the infected blood crisis. It impeded tracing the source of contamination. It meant that patients weren't alerted to their infections in a timely manner. And this in turn was a significant factor in the spread of HIV and hepatitis C. Then later on, when it came to trying to look back at how disasters had occurred, though tens of thousands of documents were sifted as part of the inquiry, it was also clear that some records were missing or worse, deliberately destroyed. Clinicians are developing increasingly robust systems for tracking embryos and gametes to prevent mix-ups and loss of samples and errors in treatment. But there's no room for complacency. A recent global study found evidence of 205 historical IVF incidents, of which 3% were from the UK, and they affected over 300 people and involved 76 lawsuits. 95% of those were specimen mix-ups, which in turn resulted from over-reliance on manual protocols. The final lesson I want to draw on is in part for government, but also the sector has a significant role in bringing it about and making it work. And that is the value of robust regulation that keeps abreast of scientific developments even as they develop. As Marc has already discussed, the inquiry found evidence of a lack of oversight, which meant that blood was inadequately screened, patient safety was compromised. Products were licensed in the 1970s despite a recognised risk of hepatitis. They were made from donations that were known to pose risks. Risks weren't acted on quickly enough. Government action was delayed until a risk of infection posed by the pooled blood donations moved from theoretical to proven. And at a clinical level too, convenience was sometimes put before patient safety on the grounds that the risks, though they were suspected, weren't yet demonstrable. Turning to the fertility sector, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act 1990, which was the first law of its kind in the world, set up the independent regulator, the HFEA, which was given sufficient power and flexibility to be able to adapt to changing societal attitudes and to certain new scientific developments. Over-regulation can be bureaucratic, costly, detrimental, but proportionate regulation can give the sector clarity about what's permitted, confidence to innovate within boundaries, and it can generate public trust. So a lesson here, I would argue, is in the value of agile and proportionate regulation. The 1990 Act has stood the test of time, but it's no longer capable of overseeing new biotechnologies like stem cell-based embryo models, which I've had something to do with of late in leading a review. Also in vitro gametogenesis. The HFEA and the recent Nuffield Council on Bioethics report are calling for some revisions to legislation to keep up with these developments. Some of these scientific developments can take years to come to fruition, but unless we debate them and prepare our regulatory environment for them, we'll risk falling into the same trap that was set out in the final inquiry report of conflating lack of certainty that an event will occur with a lack of an imperative to prepare for it. So, of the many lessons we might learn from the inquiry, I've focused on 3. Informed consent is more than getting permission to treat or to conduct research. It requires accurate and honest communication of risks, benefits, possible complications, and the likelihood of success. Record keeping and tracking requires robust systems to avoid error, but it also involves mechanisms to deal with mistakes and errors. And robust regulation, which we might sometimes resent because it increases bureaucracy, but it's also highly protective of the industry, so long as it's equipped to adapt in a timely way to biotechnological advances.
So we have our final panelists now, Bobbie Farsides. Bobbie is Professor of Clinical and Biomedical Ethics at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. She was a member of the medical ethics expert group of the Infected Blood Inquiry, along with Emma. And she was also a member of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority for many years. She's contributed to books including Vulnerability, Autonomy and Applied Ethics, Empirical Bioethics and Regulating Reproduction Donation, and many more, and many other committees has she sat on giving sage advice.
It's always a little bit of a risk going last, especially with 3 such great speakers before me, but I'm hoping that I will be able to add to what's been said. As you pointed out, Emma and I had the real privilege of co-convening the medical ethics group at the Infected Blood Inquiry. And I use the word privilege deliberately because what we learnt and the experience we had will stay with me forever. And I think in part that is due to the seriousness with which the chair of the inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, took on his responsibilities. And I've argued in a different place that many of the high standards that he set for the inquiry came from his experience of working previously with Sir Ian Kennedy on the Bristol inquiry. But the important thing was at the centre of the inquiry, and the thing that came first were the personal stories of the groups that commonly came to be referred to as the infected and the affected. And I think it's always very important to remember that the infected blood scandal is a cross-generational, intergenerational, often familial experience that touched grandparents, parents, children, partners. And as such, the stories that we heard and the stories that the inquiry heard were absolutely key to understanding the nature of the harms and the wrongs that people suffered. Of course, it's important to understand where systems failed, and I think we can learn an awful lot in terms of how we can do better. But I want to concentrate on what we need to learn about how to treat people who are caught up in any sort of medical incident, accident, or, God forbid, scandal. Because it is a traumatic experience, and I don't use that word lightly. And again, it is an intergenerational trauma that can carry on affecting people long beyond a particular individual having been infected. And that's why when I started to think about the connection with assisted reproduction, certain similarities did come to mind. Because, as Emma pointed out, the social stigma around infertility at some level makes it traumatic to be at a position where you're entering into the world of assisted reproduction. But if you're doing so with the added wish to consider, for example, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis because of an inherited bleeding disorder, you are carrying into that space a shared history that really is punctuated by significant trauma. And how is this going to make people feel? We heard very difficult stories about how people, if they were told something, were told or given bad news. So it wasn't even only a problem of people not being told they'd been infected, but when they were, it was done in an insensitive way. I've learnt subsequently from my contact with people in the broader Haemophilia Society of research that reveals that people who have sought any form of antenatal screening and testing in the past have also felt that there's been an insensitivity, a lack of understanding, and sometimes almost a cruelty of language involved in their treatment. And if you think that some of the people that would be seeking the support of those within the sector would be coming infected with HIV, hepatitis C. My mind goes back, I'm old enough to remember the very first time that Sir Robert Winston spoke publicly about his decision at the Hammersmith Hospital to offer treatment to a couple affected by HIV, and the furore that actually engendered at the time. People, again, will have lived with that, heard that, and have dealt with it or not. So my thought about one of the learnings, and again, Sir Brian has taken such a careful approach to this inquiry in that he has given his final report, but he has not closed the inquiry. And he is very mindful of his responsibility to see that his recommendations are actually put in place. And at the end of the last year, he, through the GMC and the Medical Schools Council, sent out an inquiry to medical schools in the UK, asking them what they had learnt and what they intended to pass on to their students as a result of the findings of the inquiry. Well, I would put on that list all the things that Marc and Abha and Emma have already spoken about, but I would add a few more of my own. First amongst them is to always remember that science and medicine are enriched by knowledge of and understanding and respect for the social sciences. I was shocked when I came to this work to get the sense of surprise that many people had about the contamination of blood back in the 70s and 80s, because I, as part of my undergraduate degree at the London School of Economics, read Richard Titmus's book, The Gift Relationship, which laid bare in 1971 the risks involved in sourcing blood from the USA. Subsequently, social scientists have looked at all sorts of aspects of the experience of people receiving medical care, assisted reproduction. We need to teach our medical students of the importance of knowing about this, of understanding it, and running that understanding alongside what their scientific and clinical colleagues might teach them. We have moved towards a much more specific duty of candour. The idea that if something goes wrong, we do have a responsibility to be open about it and clear about it. But have we got any better in doing that compassionately, effectively, and with a mind to the impact of what we are sharing upon the person in front of us and all those around them? And finally, if we're thinking about how best to practice medicine in future, I personally feel that we've had many lessons that tell us that if we could move to a model of trauma-informed care, where we understand the fact that patients come to us with complex histories, not simply with medical diagnoses, with social stigma, for example, experience of discrimination, experience of poor treatment. We need to understand this in planning how we offer any sort of medical care to people going forward. And sadly, I think one of the things that came out very clearly in some of the evidence in the inquiry was the fact that these events took place at a time when we were very ready to reify medical experts, where there were centres of excellence that were placed on a high pedestal and sometimes maybe escaped scrutiny, even if it would have been possible to provide that. And dare I say it, the prominence of ego in some of the evidence provided, not only by clinicians, but also by politicians and policymakers, was quite horrifying. So one of the things I would say, I'm sure the core participants would like us to take away from this, is that we must train a future generation of medical students to genuinely be patient-centred in the care that they offer, and to follow on from Sir Brian Langstaff's example of not thinking for themselves about what's important in whatever area they choose to practice, but working with patients to set goals, to establish shared values, and to ensure that we don't come to this point again.
So first one, from somebody who's anonymous, has asked, is there any evidence that if you pay donors, they're more likely to lie? And I suppose that is about, we saw the involved questionnaire that Abha showed that is used now for sperm and egg donation in Scotland. Does anyone know if there's been any research on that?
I can speak to blood donation. I can't speak to fertility donation. But yeah, I think there is quite strong evidence, particularly from the US, where there's been a tradition of paying donors, particularly for plasma donation, less so for blood component donation. That means that often people who are at higher risk, because, for example, they may have an intravenous drug habit that they need to support, are more likely to become paid donors as a source of income, and are less likely to be open and honest if they've been exposed to a particular risk, because there's a kind of financial disincentive for them to be honest in that way. Whereas non-remunerated donors, altruistic donors, tend not to have that inducement. So I think there is historic evidence, and certainly the view across European Union, view from Europe, I can't say it's necessarily the view from the US, is that countries should, wherever possible, be self-sufficient in non-remunerated donors, certainly for blood and tissues and plasma products, and organs, of course.
Does anybody else want to come in on that one? I mean, it seems to sort of pick up on the point that Bobbie made about, the importance of social science. This would be a fantastic social science research project, potentially. Emma.
Yeah, I mean, I can't set out empirical research on this off the top of my head, but it's certainly possible that payment might be seen as a risk factor if the level of payment is sufficiently high that it becomes a potentially overriding consideration for some people, that it becomes more important than their altruistic reasons for donation. And this is one of the reasons why in organ donation and surrogacy and medical research, the focus to date is on altruism. Though in some of those contexts, compensation for time is considered not to reach that level of inducement.
Abha.
There is no research that I'm aware of in gamete donation that tells us that if we pay them that they will lie, but there are obviously information, as Marc has explained, from blood donation. But thankfully in UK we have got all the gamete donation is altruistic. So it was just to say that in UK it is altruistic.
Yes, and I think in Scotland, gamete donors, if they're donating to the NHS, aren't given any compensation for their time and discomfort, etc., in doing it as in the rest of the UK or in the private sector. Then that is, but it's limited, isn't it? It's capped at a level that is thought to be not a strong inducement for people to donate. So we'll move on to the next question, which is one for you, Abha. How do you balance your duties between your employer and patient when you know there's a problem? So if something has gone wrong, what do you do?
I mean, I don't think that there is a question of balance, because even employer, which is NHS, would wish us to be very honest with the patient and explain everything to patient if anything has gone wrong, if there is any problem. So I don't think there is a need for balance. It sounds like balance that employer doesn't want us to say, but we should be telling patient, but that's not the case. We always need to be honest and open with the patients if anything has gone wrong, or if there is a problem, or if we come across anything. So I don't know if that's what the question asked for.
Yeah. Do the rest of the panel, I'm guessing the rest of the panel are going to agree with that. Is there anything anyone wants to add there? Bobbie?
I'll play devil's advocate. I suppose I wonder if behind the question is the thought that there are different employers in this sector. It's actually an unusual area of medicine in the extent to which people can work for private providers, where commercial considerations may be a little bit more at the fore. But I would agree with Abha that the clinician, as a clinician, still has that responsibility, a duty of candor, and it may feel very awkward to be employed in a situation where you weren't supported in doing that in the very best way that you could.
And Marc?
Yeah, I mean, just to support what Abha and Bobbie has said, certainly within the NHS, clearly if something goes awry, there's a professional duty of candour in respect of the clinicians involved, but there's also a clear legal duty of candour on the organisation as well. So those, certainly within an NHS environment, those should not be in conflict.
Great. Okay. I'd just seen a comment from Marilyn Crawshaw, just to sort of go back to that whether donors lie issue. And she said there is some evidence that donors have lied about their sex offending in order to be able to donate. Thankfully, she's only aware of small numbers, but she's not aware of any research about other donors' honesty with regard to payment. So thanks very much for that contribution, Marilyn. So we'll move on to another question. So this is from Hashen Yassine, and she says, this is for Abha and the others, with all the strict screening and rules, I can't imagine the fertility sector facing a crisis like an infected gamete scandal in the future. But with human error, especially with donor gametes, is it really impossible? And in such cases, are there any regulations to stop us buying gametes from external sources? I don't know what this means, from outside the UK, rather than perhaps from outside in each individual clinic. So Abha, do you want to go on that one first?
The regulations in fertility sector are extensive, and although sometimes we think regulation are burdensome, but they are for safety for the patients and safety for the future, as we have seen from infected blood inquiry. In purchasing from outside, I don't think there are any regulations which prevent us, but however, just to reassure everybody that we can only, but if a treatment is done in a licensed center, which is licensed by HFEA, patients can only purchase any gametes from external bank if we have third-party agreements with them. And there are regulations what get involved and what gets written in these third-party agreements, which does involve looking through all the paperwork, looking through all the donor history, looking through all the blood results, and we don't accept any gametes or no fertility center accept any gametes until all the paperwork has been looked through and has been investigated. So you don't sign third-party agreements unless you are convinced that all these things have been taken care of as per the regulation. And when we get inspected as well, these paperwork get looked at and they get inspected whether we have paid due diligence to all these factors or not.
Anybody else want to come in on that one before I move on? I can't see anyone unmuting themselves. So a question for you first, Marc. In being honest, do you risk legal ramifications? Should you take legal advice first? I think people are a bit nervous.
No, I never do that before I'm honest, really. I think it's very clear that you need to be honest and candid with people, obviously with due regard to sensitivity, but and that's a general policy which I personally follow in my professional life, but also in our organisational life. Things do go wrong from time to time in the real world. We all know that, or sometimes things don't come out as, from any medical treatment as medical treatments have adverse impacts sometimes. And I think it's really important to communicate that in a proactive way to patients and in an open and honest way. Certainly our practice has not been to take legal advice unless a patient raises a legal action, in which case obviously we're obliged to take legal advice at that time. That anyway would be my position.
Yep. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Emma, have you, as the lawyer on the panel, anything you want to say?
Yeah, sure. And candour is so important when things go wrong. And I think if we're talking about the legal ramifications, there are legal ramifications of not being open and honest. When things do go wrong, there are some situations where justice requires that an element of the response, which might include an explanation, it might include an apology, also includes redress. So I don't think we should shy away from that. There are times when redress is an important part of that, and that can include financial redress. The inquiry was really clear that one of the key sources of injustice was the time that it took to actually address the problems that people had faced, the infected and the affected. So delay and obfuscation and cover-up are very serious problems that do still exist in the NHS, and that's been recognised quite recently by the Health Service Ombudsman. But things that we need to tackle, and that obviously requires culture change at all levels.
And I think perhaps one thing that may have changed, societally since the infected blood inquiry, well, since the scandal, is that now if there's a silence and people don't speak out, then the vacuum is filled now on social media with conspiracy, with rumors and all sorts of nonsense that can really take hold if other people don't take charge and sort of and manage it so that people actually know the truth rather than supposition and rumor and nonsense. So anyway, I shall move on to the next question, which is from Susan Tansey, which is for you, Bobbie, and she asks, what changes do you think are needed to the medical school curriculum to implement your excellent recommendations? So Bobbie, you're in charge. What you're going to do?
Thank you, Susan. Well, in direct reference to the infected blood inquiry, I think we should see it as a live and continuing issue and use the fantastic resources that have been collected on the website, listen to the testimonies, share them with our students, read the expert reports if they speak to particular areas of your practice. But that's just one example. I am very clear that, and I would say this, wouldn't I, that the growth of the presence of medical law and ethics as what the GMC called a continual strand through medical education is really important and valuable and has to be held on to. But I would now add to that we have to really make sure that in future medical students have a very good understanding of the context in which they are offering care, because it's becoming increasingly complex and moving away from the traditional doctor-patient medical model that maybe previous generations were educated into dealing with. And I think if you look, for example, at genomics as an area of real importance to this country, we read as much about genomics in the industrial strategy as we do in the health strategy. It is hugely important that it succeeds at some level, and this could cause tensions that we're just not traditionally used to. So I would say, yes, medical education always has to focus on the scientific and the clinical skills that a safe and good doctor needs. But the best doctors, I think, are those who are challenged to understand that their patients come from a wide variety of backgrounds, have personal and societal experiences that will have a huge impact on how they seek and receive medical care and attention, and that your choice as a doctor may not be as free as it was in the past to simply pass down your judgments. You have to now form a partnership with your patients, and we need to give young doctors the skills to do that, which means education around communication and relationship building and holding, as I said, of trauma. Sorry, very long answer on behalf of all medical educators.
Very important. Thanks, Bobbie. And there's another question that I'm going to move on to again for you in the first instance, Bobbie, which is someone who's anonymous says, Bobbie talked about the reification of medical expertise and establishing centres of excellence and so on. We see in today's news that a big shake-up is going on at NHS England. Is there a risk that with more reorganisation and rebranding, we use buzzier and buzzier language to try and make things sound bright and shiny and new, and it becomes harder to spot problems? And I think it sort of does sort of follow on from the point a bit you were making about genomics, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, I fear perhaps this questioner and I have some similar worries, in that, we know from experience that some of the forms of healthcare and intervention that have the most impact on quality of life are very simple, very basic, and not very sexy. District nurses incontinence programs, I think, had one of the highest QALY ratings ever when that way of doing things was very popular. But if you think about, I think somebody said, let's hope there can't be a scandal in this sector of the same ilk. It doesn't mean there couldn't be scandals of the same ilk elsewhere in medicine. And I think one of the things that people that I've spoken to as a result of my involvement in the infected blood inquiry and my very privileged understanding that's been built by my colleague, Dr. Richard Gorman, who's done such amazing work in this space, is that the promises of gene therapy are so great to this patient group, but the risks associated with this sort of new form of medical intervention are also really profound and to some degree still not fully known and understood. So we have to particularly in relation to any patient group that has been through the trauma of the infected blood inquiry, think so carefully about anything we offer to them in future and try and ensure that their experience as patients is very different to either their direct relatives or people from their wider community.
Does anyone else want to come in on that, or the changes that have been in the news today about NHS England? I think probably Abha and Marc thinking we're in Scotland. Phew. Emma.
Well, only just to add that I agree with everything that Bobbie has just said. There are always very significant risks when changes such as this occur. But I would just add that patient safety is very high on the agenda. I was recently part of an expert group of the Health and Social Care Committee looking into patient safety. It's so crucial to trust in the NHS that patient safety really is very high on the agenda. It is something that is being thought about, I think, throughout with these changes. So I have some faith, some hope that it will remain very high on the agenda, notwithstanding these very significant changes.
Great, thank you. So I think there's the question. I think it's from a nurse. They're anonymous, but they say, I'd like to add that for some people, mostly egg donors, the acquired compensation means a holiday for them. That is incentive enough for them to be untruthful, unfortunately. Clinical judgment is imperative. And I suppose that's from perhaps a nurse who's taking that consent. I'm not quite sure. I don't know. I think it's more of a comment than a question, but I don't know whether anyone wanted to come in on that. I mean, I suppose, what is the nurse supposed to do in that situation? I suppose you don't necessarily know they're lying. It's not
Lying
necessarily
about
obvious.
what? Like, I'm interested to know where people are suspected of.
Well, I mean, I did notice one of the questions on Abha's form was about being bitten by a non-human primate. And I was thinking, God, that's a really weird thing as you were talking. And then I remembered as a child, my godmother had a monkey in a cage and she left me in the room with it. And I was very little and said, don't put your fingers through the bars, it'll bite you. Of course, she went out of the room. The first thing I did was poke my finger through to try and stroke it, and it bit me. Now, if I were filling in that form, I probably wouldn't remember, and I certainly can't remember if it drew blood, or what type of monkey it was. And I've lost touch with my godmother. But yeah, so that would be not so much a lie, perhaps, but just an omission through my incompetent memory.
Could I just make a comment in relation to egg donation? I was on the Nuffield Council working party that looked at donation of human body parts, etc. And egg donation posed a particular challenge because if we move away from an altruistic model, and Emma's already told us, that in itself poses some risk, we usually then seek to find a way of recompensing people that is in accord with the labour that they provide or the risks that they run, and that is seen as fair and non-exploitative. And to not put too fine a point on it, to donate sperm and to donate eggs are very different procedures. And I think one of the reasons why the reward looks more like a potential incentive is because previously it was thought not to reflect in any way the labour and the risk involved in being an egg donor. So I think it's a little bit of an intractable problem, to be honest.
Abha.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of history behind. So even the European regulations which have come recently, their summary paper says that donors should not be obviously benefited financially, but they should not be out of pocket as well. Because although sperm donation may seem easier, but the number of visits involved to each clinic is a lot. And if somebody is traveling from a distance and other things, obviously there are costs involved. So both egg donation and sperm donation are very intensive. Nobody gets accepted in any of the licensed fertility clinics just like that, because from inquiry to actually donating, the proportion is very, very less. So you're talking about 5% who actually donate from the inquiry for sperm donor. So the scrutiny or the filter is a lot. So they go through number of appointments, including counseling, number of medical appointments or clinical appointments, either with specialist nurses or doctors. So a lot goes through in preparing or till we reach the time of donation. So number of appointments, number of questionnaires, and number of medical history taking. So it's not easy for anybody to lie, because they go through number of professionals and they are trained to kind of look for subtle signs as well. And it's all about safety, because as we say, donor is donating for somebody else and they are going through a lot to donate. I mean, if you think about egg donation, somebody is undergoing almost an IVF cycle themselves, going through the stimulation injections, which risking them for hyperstimulation. Yes, we have got all the strategies to prevent that now, but still there is a surgical procedure, there is a daily injection, there are monitoring, so repeated visits. So there is a lot involved. And I don't think just for the sake of, which used to be £750 or now £950, which HFE allows, that anybody will go through that's not, it is done altruistically in UK and goes through quite a lot of scrutiny.
Mm. And also there's a very high attrition rate, isn't there? People come forward thinking they'll do it, not and as they become more appraised of what it involves, realize that it's not for them. There's a question which sort of develops on from this, or a point really from Valentina Mauro, who says whether egg and sperm donors may be induced to lie. We see potential egg and sperm share providers hide important information in the fear that this would disqualify them from donating, and then they'd have to pay the full cost of their fertility treatment, which then is quite a lot more than £1,000. And there've been a lot of ethical event. I think we did one probably about 16 years ago about egg sharing in those sorts of scenarios. But I suppose I don't know whether anyone on the panel wants to come in on that and talk about the ethics of that and whether actually that is more of an inducement. I'm not seeing anyone rush in.
I think I was
Bobbie.
part of that event, Sarah.
Well, if you can remember the year, well done, Bobbie, because I certainly can't. It's probably Sandy will message me now and say, "Oh, don't you remember it was here?" I think it was in the Royal Society of Medicine. I remember the venue, but not the year.
Yeah.
Okay. So someone's asked, is removing stigma one of the most important elements to ensure openness? And how do we do this? I think that's quite an interesting one. I'll go to you, Abha, first, and then I think Bobbie might want to say something.
Yeah, I think it is very important to remove the stigma. We still have very much secrecy that egg donation and sperm donation, and obviously there's confidentiality there. However, I think it's the greatest gift of life anybody can give to people, and it's something to be proud of rather than having the stigma. So it is really important, and whosoever's raised this point is fantastic, that if we remove the stigma, the openness will be much more, and I think it will be safety as well, much more.
And Bobbie, did you want to say something or?
Well, I mean, I think understanding stigma is key to understanding all sorts of areas of medicine, because so many different diagnoses can be stigmatized for different sorts of reasons, and things change over time in terms of, what is seen as unproblematic and acceptable and what is not. I think attitudes towards infertility shift, but as Abha also says, there's been a sort of cloak of secrecy over donation and use of gametes in the past that is simply not feasible anymore. So we have an interest in ensuring that those who are either told or discover that they were either born of donated gametes, or those who choose to share with a subsequent partner the fact that they donated egg or sperm in an earlier life, should feel able to do so with the emphasis on this idea of what an altruistic and generous act that was, and hopefully what a great outcome it had, rather than any sense of shame or imposed secrecy. But that's probably easier said than done. I think we're possibly still a bit far away from that.
Thanks, Bobbie. There's a question now for Emma from Jacqueline Nichols. She says, Emma, do you think there's a case for more explicit legal guidance on the responsibilities of doctors in relation to the scope of consent law with respect to brokering discussion of implications and uncertainty?
Thank you for the question. It's just such an interesting area, because I have come across the view a number of times that clinicians might be reluctant to talk about uncertainties because they sometimes see their role as being reassuring, or wanting to talk about the bits that are certain and perhaps gloss over some of the areas that aren't so certain. So I think it's a really good suggestion. The GMC, in their guidance on consent, is clear that doctors seeking consent should refer both to uncertainties about diagnosis and prognosis, but also about any uncertainties about the risks and benefits in treatment. That guidance is clear about the importance of being honest about any limits in knowledge or limits in general understanding about a certain issue, which is often the case, particularly when we're dealing with novel treatments, for example, or areas where really there is a lot of uncertainty about prognosis. So I think there is guidance there. For example, the GMC talks about how you can revisit uncertainties as treatment progresses. But I also take the point. I think it's a really valid one, and I think greater training and focus on this particular issue would indeed be valuable. So thanks for the question.
Great. Sounds like a fantastic essay question to me for your students down the track. So great. So I think we'll go to Marc first with this one. Do the recommendations from the inquiry report about keeping records apply retrospectively? I suppose they've asked it in relation to fertility treatment, I suppose in relation to anything. Prior to, in the fertility sector, the legislation and the regs, records in private clinics were sometimes destroyed. I know lots of people have come across that over the years. So what is the status of these recommendations, I suppose?
Okay, so obviously it's difficult to apply legislation retrospectively to records that have already been destroyed. That can't be done. Under the blood quality and safety regulations and the human tissue quality and safety regulations, there's a stipulation that records traceability and associated records should be retained for 30 years. Now, the BSQR came into UK legislation in 2005. So at the time that it came in, we already had records dating back several decades, and we retained those records. But many hospital blood banks would have had a sunset clause on their records, and obviously, if they'd been destroyed in the normal course of events 7 or 8 years earlier, there was no way of retrieving those. So I guess I'm working my way towards an answer to your question. The law applies from the point at which that law comes into effect, and from that point it will be retrospective for those records which are extant at that time. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, BSQR and TSQR and obviously the IBI apply to the blood sector, but I think it would be prudent for those colleagues who work in the fertility centre to extrapolate across into your sector as well, because they are, after all substances of human origin.
So what is the status of the recommendations from the infected blood inquiry? Are they, because I suppose I'm just thinking about how I heard on the news today briefly at lunchtime that all the recommendations for the from the Grenfell inquiry are going to be implemented. And so have we had that sort of commitment, and forgive me if I've missed this, from government that all those recommendations are going to be implemented?
So Brian's recommendations are to the government, both the UK government and to devolved administrations from a legal perspective. The UK government made an initial response, I think it was just before Christmas, and it was a fairly detailed response. So some of those recommendations were accepted in full, and some were accepted in principle. I'm sorry, I don't have the recollection of which fell into which category. So some clearly the government just I'm reiterating, accepted the recommendations as they were written. Some clearly the government either had reservations about or wanted further time to think about. I believe another report, the final report response back from the UK government, taking into account devolved administrations as well, is due, I believe, in May of this year, when thinking will have advanced.
Great, thanks.
So it's really open to the government to accept in full, accept in principle, or I guess not accept the recommendations, though this government has not done that.
Okay. Right. Next question I'm going to go for is someone asks about the recommendations. They said one of them, the recommendations, was that the patient voice be enabled and empowered. What could and should this look like in the fertility sector context? I don't know who wants to go first on that one. I'm in two minds whether to go to Abha first or to Bobbie. Of course, it's like they're playing poker. I'm going to go to Abha first.
Thank you, Sarah. I think, it was recommendation that patient voice is enabled and empowered. And in fertility sector, again, the patient voice is enabled, empowered. We are meant to make decisions jointly. It is about the patients. So it's no decision without the patients. It's a joint decision making, especially because evidence is limited. It's a new treatment, and we have obviously thorough discussion with patients to make a joint decisions. And we do get inspected on this from HFEA as well. When they come, obviously they check these things that we are doing it right, or other inspections that we have. So it's not that is not happening in the fertility area. It absolutely is happening. But at the same time, I would say that we all refrain from doing the treatments if somebody has heard on either on Google or somewhere else, which are not evidence-based. So it might seem that although patient is asking for the treatment and we are not giving that treatment, but there are explicit reasons behind, because we want to work on evidence-based practice rather than trying something out with research setting in the clinical setting which has not been proven, and it could be dangerous treatment for which we don't know the side effects still for.
Bobbie, I was going to say, from your time as an authority member, do you think that fertility patients are quite empowered?
No, possibly not. I think many patients are facing such sort of personal challenges, coming to terms with their infertility issues, financial burdens, and a very strong dependency upon being able to sort of feel positive and hopeful for whatever is offered to them by clinicians. I think there are some fantastic clinicians in this sector, don't get me wrong, but I think if you look at it sort of sociologically, anthropologically, things are set up in such a way that individuals have so much going on. It's a big ask to get them to also be representative of their group or whatever. So this is why I think patient networks, charities, etc., are so important, and there have been some excellent ones over the years. I'm thinking, for example, of Fertility Network, where people can go, share their experiences, share their stories. I think empowering people is not always about getting them to come and sit round a table with you in your setting. It's about going out and speaking to people in their own terms, giving them a range of ways and opportunities in which to express their needs and concerns and their dissatisfactions, but also where things have gone well, to celebrate where things have gone well. But I think with the best will in the world, it's very hard because, again, where stigma comes in is where people have had a successful journey through assisted reproduction. It's often the last thing they want to talk about once they take their baby home. They want to come back into the normal world again, and it's unfair of us to expect them to become advocates in those circumstances.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that last point. I think it is, people just want to get on with normal family life, and put it behind them, and I think that's very precious to a lot of people. So we've got quite a few questions on quite a similar theme, of how much to tell people when things go wrong. Is there a situation when you think it's right not to tell a patient that things have gone wrong? And quite a few more along those themes. So I just sort of and then one that's more specific, which is about secrecy. And is secrecy a good thing in these situations? I know the panel are all going to say no to that, I think, from the questions we've had so far. But they say even about the composition of culture media. So for people who are not aware, the actual composition of the medium that the embryos are stored in is not known, outside to people in the sector, only the manufacturer. So I don't know who wants to go first on those. It's sort of a bit of a bundle for you. And you may feel that you've answered some of them already. But I think in terms of this whole, how much, I suppose it's how frank are you when things have gone wrong is perhaps one way of describing it. Perhaps we'll go to Bobbie again, as she's just spoken. We'll go to Bobbie first, and then perhaps go to Abha and Emma.
So, I mean, that is a bundle. What would you like me to
I think
concentrate on?
about this wrong thing, the situations when you think it's you don't think it's right to tell the
Yeah.
patient that something is wrong.
Yeah. I think your choice of or the questioner's choice about talking about mediums and such like is a good one, because at one level it's such a technical issue that maybe only the people in the sector would start to have unease about it. We sometimes, as lay people, don't know what to worry about. And I would say that part of your professional responsibility as a doctor is to know what to worry about and to find constructive ways to dig into those worries before they become problems for your patients. But we have a very difficult history around what we tend to immediately inflate into whistleblowing. I would say if we could encourage a culture, sorry to use that word, but it within medicine where people do embrace uncertainty, as Emma said, and admit where they don't know things and where things might not look to be as good as we would like, and start to deal with them openly and transparently, we could avoid a lot of the sorts of problems that were so obvious within the infected blood inquiry. I don't know if that's the right sort of answer, but
yeah. So Abha, I don't know whether you want to come in on that and sort of say a bit more about the culture media, or about, that one person has asked, how much should you tell the patients if something goes wrong, that was directed to you.
I think how much you should tell the patient is you should be very honest and tell as much as they're required to know and as much as you can tell, actually, because there's no reason to hide. Nobody comes to, everybody tries to work to the best of their ability and best of what the knowledge is available. And that's exactly what has been highlighted in infected blood inquiry, that knowledge was available but was not available to everybody. So that's important that knowledge is disseminated and we act on the knowledge and not act alone, because different clinicians could act differently and interpret it differently. So there has to be a more joined up nationwide approach, and that is one of the things, as I say, coming out of the inquiry. And if anything goes wrong, or if you find out that anything new is happening, say, for example, happened in COVID, we had to change everything. So we had to tell patients explicitly how much we knew. Obviously, when more information keeps on coming, then you keep adding to it. But as much as you know, there is no need to hide, and there's no reason to hide, as I can concern.
Emma, did you want to come in any of those things to?
It was a related issue, really, from one of the other questions about withholding information about some of the risks that might be inherent in some forms of treatment. So the law is quite clear about the sort of risks that should be told to patients. It's not about telling the patient every single possible risk. That would be overwhelming. It's not about transferring all the information that the doctor has to the patient. That isn't the duty, it's selective. The law talks about material risks and making those clear to the patient, the sort of material risks that the patient would want to know, or that patients generally would want to know. But the law also has built in within it an exception to that called the therapeutic exception, whereby it's recognised that there can be situations where a patient could be caused serious harm if they were told about the particular risk that's inherent in treatment. And in that case, they don't have to tell the patient that particular risk. However, the law also says that a clinician can't just do this because they think the person wouldn't consent to treatment if they were told about that risk. And the law also says that it's very narrow. It's so narrow, in fact, that it's very hard to think of an example of where it would be relevant to withhold that sort of risk. Rather, what tends to happen is that it's the way in which a risk is communicated to a patient that becomes important. So it might be that part of the information is given in a first meeting and part of it in a second meeting. Obviously, that's very difficult in a time when appointments are so precious. But I just wanted to bring that up, the idea that this transferal of knowledge isn't a whole and complete transferal. It's not about telling the patient everything. It's about giving them the information that they need to make an autonomous decision about something. And that is whether you're talking about the risks inherent in treatment or about their prognosis or about their diagnosis. It's trying to think, what information does this patient need to be told in order to make autonomous decisions, recognizing that really that those decisions are a shared responsibility insofar as the clinician is giving their expertise in order to help the patient then make the decision about what should happen going forward.
Great. Does anyone want to comment on the culture media thing, Abha?
No, I was just going to come in for regarding Emma's saying, yes, absolutely. I mean, information needs to be given so that they can make the decision what needs to be done for their care, for their treatment. But I think where we were coming for is to as much information as is available to us should be given to patient if anything has gone wrong, so that we are not hiding any information. So as much information that we can give them about what went wrong and what are the next steps and how it can be, there's damage limitation can be done.
Okay. So someone has followed up on the enabled and empowered patients question, saying, what are your thoughts about the voices of Black and ethnic minority patients? Do you think they've got the same level of being enabled and empowered? Abha?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think any of us kind of say that anybody on the basis of race, ethnicity, socio-demographic status has got any different rights. Everybody who comes to the clinic has absolutely same rights, and same empowerment has to be given to everyone who is coming to clinic. It should not matter based on the race, ethnicity, or any such things.
Okay. And then someone has asked, do you believe the legacy of the blood scandal has delayed progress in allowing those living with HIV or hepatitis from being able to access fertility clinic treatments or be known donors when the evidence showed that undetectable viral loads meant no risk of it being passed to baby? As some people be aware, there's been a recent change now allowing that to happen. Do you think that was delayed because of as a result of the blood scandal, or is it just one of those things that's taken time? Don't know.
I
Bobbie.
nervously respond to this because I'm not an expert on the medical side of it, but my sense is that we, of course, became very precautionary and we looked to protect the blood supply. And I worked very closely with NHSBT during the organ donation task force and got to know people there and understand how seriously they took the responsibility. And again, when I was on the BCJD incident panel, you know, that it's a huge responsibility looking after the blood stock, and it possibly seemed a completely logical thing to look to halt donations by people who were known to be infected by HIV in the aftermath. Or suspected. That's that it went beyond that, or be at risk of. But I think HIV medicine is amazing and has come on so much. And this idea of the undetectable viral load and the way in which people can live with HIV and the way in which treatments have advanced, we just have to keep rethinking what we think about HIV, people living with HIV, destigmatizing it, drawing it into mainstream medicine, and then acting in a proportionate way in relation to any risks if they continue to exist. And we know that risks are much, much lower now than we thought they were in the past. So it again goes back to that idea of learning from the evidence and understanding the science, and then adjusting our behaviours in such a way as to not discriminate against people. And I always felt that not having the opportunity to be altruistic is a form of discrimination. You're treating people unequally for what should be irrelevant reasons sometimes.
Great. I'm going to give read the final question, so we're about to run out of time, is one for all of you to answer quite quickly. And that is, what do the panel think is the biggest possible risk area in the fertility treatment sector, and why? So who wants to go first? Let's go with Emma. We'll go Emma and then Abha.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think the biggest risk isn't particularly strongly related to what we've been discussing today. I think the biggest risk is the risk of injustice that comes from inequity of access. And I think we need to make fertility treatment accessible to many. But one that is related, I think there's a risk that our regulatory schemes don't keep up with technological advances around AI and around new biotechnologies. And that risk is in two parts. On one side, if we don't keep up with these, we could limit their potential, and they have great potential. But then, of course, on the other side, the other risk is that it could lead to breaches of ethical principle if we don't ensure that there is a good system of regulation. So they would be mine. Thank you.
Abha?
Now, in addition to what Emma has said, I think one of the biggest risks we face is the false information and the sort of fake news, because there is a lot of fake information available, and it's so much unfiltered information available, and these are not very high success rate treatment. So people want to try anything and everything, and that's where the problem comes in. So I think the control of the fake information or the false information would be very good.
Marc?
Gosh, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to comment, but I will anyway. I suppose for me, more broadly, I think there is a risk associated with our legal regulation because things become embedded in law, and the law is slow to change, is difficult to change, and as Abha remarks, obviously, technology is changing fast, and risks can change fast. As we commented earlier, the Europeans have moved to a much more flexible form of regulation, which I think we probably need to consider in the UK as well. I'll also come back to something I said during my presentation, is that new viral infections haven't gone away anywhere, and they are a continuing threat, perhaps a greater threat even than they were in the 1980s due to globalization and other factors. So we need to remain very, very vigilant and precautionary in our stance in order to protect our patients.
And Bobbie, I'll give you the last word.
Well, can I cheat slightly and just endorse what Abha said? I think it's so important. I hear time and time again in various areas where social influencers might have more power to get ideas across, and often false and misguided ideas and false information. And unfortunately, we live in a political world where expertise is constantly being undermined. And even, dare I say it, some very important political roles in other domains are being given to people who play into the worst sort of misinformation. So I absolutely agree that that's possibly where the biggest risk to patients lies.